Hi, this is Tom Wadsworth. The presentation you're about to hear is one that I gave a year ago to two different groups of pastors in my area. I did not want to share this information with the general public, frankly, because I think that the content of this presentation is perhaps too alarming to regular folks and something that maybe only pastors should be aware of. But now that a year has passed since I presented this information, I'm now beginning to realize that everybody needs to know this. And I also come from a background in not only in ministry but also in communications, where openness of information is sort of a cardinal rule for my approach to things. I don't want to shield anybody from some truths that are out there. So here we go. I entitled this "The Coming Church Attendance Crisis." And if you have some concerns about church attendance at your church, I urge you to listen. If you have some concerns about your church surviving another 10 years, I think the information here in this presentation will be of benefit and be enlightening to you. So let's begin. First off, you may have seen a book that came out in 2023, just about a year ago from where I'm speaking now, put out by Jim Davis and Michael Graham along with Ryan Burge. They put together a book called The Great De-Churching, in which they were quantifying the exact amount of de-churching that's been going on in America. In other words, lots and lots, hundreds and thousands, and yes, millions of people have been bailing out of going to church in our culture. One of the quotes from that book I have here on the screen: more people have left the church in the last 25 years, they say, than all the new people who became Christians from the First Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, and the Billy Graham Crusades combined. Now let that sink in. In my own research and my own observations from my own community confirms what they are saying, and that the seriousness of the drop in church attendance is that bad. Where am I coming from? Well, I've been conducting church attendance surveys in my own little community of Dixon, Illinois, for the last 40 years. I first did it in 1982, now 42 years ago. And here's some things you ought to know about this survey. First, I've done 8 of these surveys over the last, 42 years, since 1982. You see the years when I did them there on the screen. In this survey, I contacted every church within a 5-mile radius of my hometown of Dixon, Illinois. Now, at various times, there was as many as maybe 35 churches within that 5-mile radius. We're now down to 30 churches, which shows you something of the decline that's going on. But I called all of them, and I asked them all to participate in a survey. And I asked them for their average weekend attendance, knowing that some of these folks would be meeting on Saturdays as well as on Sundays. And I wanted to know their average weekend attendance. And I was comparing, for the most part, October to October. I find that if you were to ask people to compare their attendance in, let's say, in July, when the summer slump is well in effect, and then compare that with September, when the new season begins and a lot of people are starting to come back to church, at least according to the old patterns, that wouldn't be fair. So I've tried to compare the same month to the same month in these 8 different years when I've conducted this survey. But the most important detail of this survey, it's based on a head count. In other words, I asked these pastors to give me their average weekend attendance of the last couple of weeks. It was based on an actual head count of the number of heads in the pews in these churches. Now, this is much different than getting a representative sample of people in town and asking them whether they've been to church in the last 7 days. This is a head count of actual people in actual pews in an actual church during these particular survey periods. Now I'm going to reveal the findings of the 2023 survey, which is the most recent one I did. I completed it in October of 2023, compiled all the results, and then released them to pastors only in November of 2023. First off, the first finding that's of significance is that there has been a 60% drop in church attendance since 1983, from a high of 6,327 heads in pews in Dixon, Illinois, back in '83, to only 2,541 in 2023, 40 years later. Here's a graphic depiction of how this looks. Now, every H you see in this big block represents 100 people going to a church somewhere in Dixon, Illinois. Now, this is in 1983, you would have seen all these different H's. Each H represents 100 people, and there are, 6,300 people represented by this particular graph. Now, as time went by, hundreds of people gradually started to drop out as the years rolled by, from 1983 to 85 to 87. And then I took another survey in 1999. This is how many people were left in that year. By 2004, even more people had dropped out. Each H you see dropping off the screen is 100 people no longer attending church. And then finally to 2012, about 12 years ago, that's how many hundreds of people were left. And the drops continued to fly away as we finally got to where we are in 2023 with only that many 100 attendees left. That shows you how hundreds of people have gradually and consistently left going to church over that period of time. Here's another way to look at this. To compare 1983 with 2023, again, there were 6,327 people in pews in Dixon in '83, compared to only about 2,500 in pews in Dixon in 2023. Now, there's more to these findings. If you wanted to just compare the last 12 years, which is also helpful, you might think, well, yeah, a lot of people dropped out from 40 years ago, but it's been relatively stable lately. Well, not true. The drop since 2012 is almost a 30% drop over that period of time, from about 3,500 to about 2,500. And here's another visual depiction of what's been going on there. You see all the H's representing, each one represent 100 people. From 2012 to 2023, only 2,500 people are left in church. And now, of course, we're about to enter into 2025, and the numbers, I fear, have even dropped from where they were at the end of 2023. So more with these findings. So the drop since '83 has been 60%. The drop since 2012 has been 29%. But now let's look at the number of churches that had an attendance of 100 people or more on average. In 1983, there were 12 such churches in my hometown that had an average attendance of 100 people or more. But in 2023, that number had dropped to only 4. And here's a graphic depiction of that. In 1983, you see these 12 different squares in the midst of this big square. Each one of those squares represents 100, rather not 100 people in church, but rather a church that had an average attendance of 100 people or more. And there were 12 such larger churches in the Dixon area. But as you transition to 2023, 8 of those churches have gone away. They haven't gone away exactly, but they're no longer averaging 100 or more. And one of these 4 churches was averaging right at 100 exactly in the end of 2023, And I already know that there have been some losses in that church since then. So now, in reality, at the end of 2024, there are only 3 churches that have 100 or more left in Dixon. These are Protestant churches, not Catholic churches. I'll talk about Catholic churches here in just a minute. So on with the more findings. In 1983, the median Protestant church attendance was 75 people. In other words, half of the churches in town had an average attendance of 75 people or more, or 75 people or less. And I remember from back in 1983 when I did this study that also the national, or actually the average for all of U.S. and Canada and North America, the average for North American churches at that time was also 75. That was the median church attendance. Half the churches in North America in 1983 averaged 75 or more, or 75 or less, and again, half of them were less than that. But now advance up 40 years and see where the median Protestant church attendance is. It has dropped all the way to 43. In other words, now half the churches have only 43 or less in attendance, and half of them have 43 or more. That shows also the dramatic difference that has taken place in Protestant churches in my little hometown of Dixon, Illinois, population about 15,000. We'll talk about that also here in just a minute. Back to more findings. Over that span of time, the 40 years from 1983 to 2023, the Protestant churches have lost in total 55% of their strength that they had back in 2023, while Catholic churches over that same span of time have lost 66%. Now, nobody has any bragging rights here. Everybody's losing people by hundreds over that span of time. It just happens to be that the Catholics have lost a few more than the Protestants have in that same span of time. Here's a graphic depiction of that loss. If you look at the Protestant losses since 1983, that big circle you see on your screen represents all the people who were attending in 1983. But that brown or tan or whatever the color that is, a portion of that circle represents the 55% of people who have dropped out of church since that time. If you compare that with the Catholic losses since 1983, they have lost, yes, percentage-wise a few more. Their drop in attendance has been 66%. So they have lost 2/3 of the people who were attending just 40 years ago. At any given moment in the last 100 years, if anybody were to say you're going to lose 66% of your people in the next 40 years, that would have been a dramatic shock to anybody. And most people would have said, no, no way, it would have never happened. Well, that's where we are, folks, right now. Now, another aspect of the findings of my research. In 1983, of all the people attending church in 1983, 56% of them were Protestant. But now, since Catholics have been losing more than the Protestant churches in town, in 2023, the number of the percentage of attendees who are attending Protestant churches is now up to 63%. If you look at this also graphically, you can see it like this. 44% of people attending church in Dixon in 1983 were Catholic, in a Catholic church. Whereas in 2023, 63% of those attendees are now Protestant and 37% of those going to church are now in Catholic churches. In other words, you could say that the Catholics are losing market share. It's one way to look at that. Perhaps not the best way, but that is one reality of the loss in church attendance over that span of time. Now, there's a certain factor that's involved in this loss that occurred to me after I first gathered the data in this most recent survey of 2023, and that is the senior factor. If the average church, or the typical or the median church, is only averaging 43 or less in attendance, the question comes out, how many of these people are old geezers like myself? Because if most of them are seniors, the future of these churches is rather grim, right? So let's look at some numbers here. The Dixon population in 2022 was about 15,000 something, and 17% of everybody who lived in Dixon at that time was 65 years old or older. These kind of census data statistics are available with the U.S. Census. But 17% of the population, of the overall population of Dixon, is 17%. But if you look at the population of those who are attending church in Dixon, the average Dixon church only has now just 52%, or rather has 52% of people going to church now are 65 or older. This shows that the population of people going to church is really a whole bunch of gray-haired folks. It's not like, it doesn't represent the city as a whole. The people who are attending church are much more increasingly older folks and much less increasingly younger folks. This presents a real problem for the future of the church in Dixon and perhaps also in your community. More details here. I also found out that 33% of the churches in Dixon right now, 70% are 70% of the people attending are sick. Let me get this straight. I know there's a lot of percentages here to get this right. Of all the churches that have 70% of their members or their people attending are 65 or older, 33% of all the churches in Dixon now have 70% of their attendees are senior citizens. This is a problem when that huge amount of people, huge amount of churches are in this situation. Now, we love our seniors, and all churches have to love their seniors because they are loyal and they are generous. If you analyze your income in a given church, you're going to find out that the vast majority of your income, probably no matter what church you have, is coming from the geezers, from people like me, who are generously giving to the church for whatever reason. Maybe it's been our habit for years and years, but they also believe in what's going on, and so they've been giving heavily. But, and here's the but that you see on the screen, but the seniors aren't going to be around for long. They don't stay 65 once they hit 65. In another year, they're going to be 66. In 10 years, 76. In another 10, they're 86. And pretty soon, they're 6 feet underground, and they're no longer contributing to your church. So that's the senior factor, and I think that's a rather significant issue that we have to look at. But here's another issue that I think it's important to share, and I've known this for a very long time, but I've been wanting some sort of format to get this information out to more people. The Gallup polls that have been taken every year for years and years and years that ask people if are they going to church, and what they've been reporting has been out there in the public eye for a long time. What I'm saying is these Gallup polls do not represent reality, and let me explain why. Here's a good chart of the Gallup polls taken since the 1940s. Now, back then, about 40% of people were attending to church, and it hit a peak in 1960s. You see on your screen right over there. This is about 1960s, 50s and 60s. Things are hitting around the 50% mark. And then, according to Gallup, it stayed pretty steady around the 40% mark until it started to drop around 2010. And down here, they're at 31% here in 2020. I believe that's the number you can't see on your screen that I apologize I'm hiding for you. But it has dropped just down to 31%. But any pastor knows, at least in my community, there's no way 31% of adults are attending church on a given weekend in any community in America. I know that's a big statement, but I challenge anybody to prove me wrong here. As I've looked at these statistics over the years, it's raised a huge question mark as to what in the world, where is Gallup coming from? Well, they're coming from this, and they're not trying to distort or mislead anybody. You see the questions they ask there on your screen at the top? Did you yourself happen to attend church, synagogue, mosque, or temple in the last 7 days or not? Well, as some studies have proven, people are not telling the truth to Gallup when they call. And some studies have been done on this. Why is Gallup misleading? Well, there's a 1993 study taken about 30 years ago where they found out that phone respondents don't want to embarrass themselves before somebody else on the phone. No matter if they don't, even if they don't even know that person, and they ask them, "Have you attended church in the last 7 days?" People are likely to say, "Yeah, well, we drove by there. It was maybe a couple weeks ago. But yeah, we went." Well, there's been some communities where researchers went in and they tried to verify the data they were getting from Gallup and actually do head counts in churches. Head counts don't match up with the Gallup count. And my research was based on head counts, real bodies in real pews at that time. Another part of this particular survey is this. If you look at the attendance, or rather the census of Dixon, compared to the attendance in churches, you get a 17% ratio. In other words, on any given Sunday, 17% of the Dixon population is attending church. That's if you take my attendance stats of, 2,500 people now going to church on a given weekend in Dixon, compared to the population of Dixon, which is around 15,000. You get a 17% figure. However, that's probably not right either, and I'll explain why. My survey covered churches that are outside the city limits of Dixon. It included a radius of 5 miles outside the city limits of Dixon. So we are covering a population base much larger than the Dixon city population within the city limits. Here's a map of the city of Dixon in northern Illinois. Again, the population's around 15,000. Now you see that white spot there in the center, right there. That's where the city limits are. But my survey covered a 5-mile radius outside here, all the way out to these marks. And there's several churches that are in all throughout this area here, not just in the city, that were also included in this survey. So really, in order to figure out what percentage of the population is attending church, Gallup says 31%. Well, if you look at my study, I think in reality there's about 13% or less of humans, of people, that includes kids, by the way, are attending weekly. Here's another way to look at this. There are 2,541 people attending the churches that are within this big circle. There is, within this big circle, I think there's a population of about 20,000 people. Now, Dixon proper has about 15.5, 15.6, I forget what it is. I've got it in my stats. But you can add another 5,000 people because you have all these little communities like Woosung and Palmyra and Grand Tour and Nachusa all throughout there. Plus there's subdivisions outside of the city limits, and there are people there who do go to church. And so if you had a total population base of 20,000, which may be a bit generous, and only 2,500 are attending there, you get a result of only 13%. So when you see Gallup saying that 31% of people are attending church, you can shake your head and say, ain't no way. More likely it's around 13%. Now you might be thinking, well, Dixon is probably an irreligious community and nobody goes to church in these small towns. Well, it's just the opposite, folks. This is a small, conservative, rural farm town, and people in this area tend to be rather conservative. They tend to be rather religious. And if people in a town like this only have 13% that are going, think what it's like in Chicago, Orlando, in New York, Los Angeles, Las Vegas. I don't think it's 13%. I think it's much less elsewhere. Dixon would be on the upper end of a percentage of people who attend churches. So let's get down to the painful Prognosis. And I hope you've listened up to this point, because here we get down to some serious realities that we need to face. Here's a graph that depicts the results of my surveys since 1983. I'm just going to show you 6 of the representative ones from 83 up to 2023. Now, you'll note that these numbers down at the bottom, 1983 to 19, that's a 6-year span here before I did the next survey. It's a 10 years before this one, then it's only 5 to here, 8 to here, and then 11 till I get to the 2023 survey. Now, the thing you want to do with you're looking at a bar graph like this is look at the trend line. Where are things going? Where will things be in a few years? And if you follow this trend line, which has been continuing rather consistently for 30 years, more than 30 years, the church attendance would be 0 by the year 2050. Are you letting that soak in? I have more bad news, because it's actually not 2050. If you really follow the numbers and where they're pointing to, you get to 0 by the year 2047. Now, I don't think it'll get to 0. I'm not telling you it's going to get to 0. I think there will always be churches alive and start surviving somewhere, somehow. But this is the trend line. And as time goes by, it actually gets harder for churches to survive the smaller they get. Now, here's where I'm coming from on this point. I think we need to look at something known as critical mass. And churches are losing critical mass. What is critical mass, you say? Well, it's defined as the minimum size or amount of something that is required to start or to maintain a venture of any kind, like a church, for example. As churches get down to just a handful of people, they can no longer survive. They can't pay the bills for the building. They can't pay any salaries for pastors or janitors or whoever you're paying to do whatever they're doing. Somehow, you got to have the money to sustain all this stuff. And so there's a certain minimum size or amount. And so what I did in analyzing the data, I came up with a formula that may be of help to somebody. I call it a 60-40 church. What do I mean by a 60-40 church? And this, by the way, is just a proposal. A 60-40 church is a church that is losing critical mass. What does the 60 mean? The 60 means if a church has at least 60% of its attendees who are 65 or older. And the 40 means it has 40 attendees or less. If it has this 60-40 factor, then I think the church is likely to close its doors in 10 to 20 years. Think about this now. Here's a visual depiction of what I'm talking about, a 60-40 church. This particular church, you see 60 different bodies in this, or rather you see 40 different bodies in this church. 40 people are attending, and 60% of them are seniors. The gray humans in this depiction are senior citizens. The gray-headed old ladies and old men like myself, or bald, as you may see. These are the old geezers in church. And if a church has 60% of its people are old folks and only has 40 people who are attending, I suggest that church is in serious trouble for the future. Probably is not going to last 10 or maybe 20 years at best. Right now in Dixon, Illinois, there are 7 churches that fit this bill as being 60-40 churches. In other words, they have attendance of 40 people or less, and 60% of those people who are attending, at least 60%, are geezers who are 65 or older. Sometimes they're a lot older than that. But 5 more churches of the 30 churches now alive are dangerously close to being a 60-40 church. For example, one of these churches has an attendance of 50 people. That may sound like that's great news, But in this particular church of 50, 80% of the people who are attending that church are over 65. And in reality, they're probably over 75. It's really getting up there. How can that church survive? How can those 12 churches survive another 15 years? I think it's a serious question. As the numbers get down there, and most of the folks are geezers, how are you going to be able to attract a young family? How are you going to be able to attract or even build a youth group to be able to keep anybody who is between the ages of 5 and 18? How? If they don't have any friends who are there to get together with, to build relationships with, how is the church going to survive another generation? I think the situation is rather dire. So you might be asking, well, what are the reasons for this great decline in church attendance over the last 40 years? Well, I've been studying this for a long time and gathering whatever research that has been out there. And I'm going to just throw out 10 reasons that I've come across that have been proposed by other scholars and researchers on this issue. And you can take your pick of which one of these 10 seems to apply to you or make sense to you. The first reason for the decline in church attendance over the last 40 years goes back to all the public pastor scandals, and there's still more going on. It seems like every week in the news here, even today. But going back to the 80s, you remember Jimmy Swaggart or Jim Baker and the scandals that went on with these highly publicized televangelists at the time, or even the Catholic pastor, the Catholic priest, and the sex abuse scandals of the 80s and 90s and how devastating that was. There's no question that this has caused an erosion in the amount of faith that people have, not only in their pastors, but also in their churches as well. I ran across this study that was published in Christianity Today in January of 2024. That's the number you can't see there. I apologize for blocking that. It was January of 2024. When they were, this particular study by Gallup was gauging pastor credibility. And back in, in the 70s here, 60% of people said that clergy had a high or very high level of honesty or ethics. That even went up close to 70% down there in 1985. It was still up there pretty high in around 2000. But then it's been on a continual decline, way down to here, which is at about 32% here in 2020. So it's gone from 60% down to 30%. Yeah, 30%, not 20%. It has dropped in half of peoples who believe that pastors are credible. This is a problem that we have to face. I think this is contributing to the decline in church attendance. Another reason for the decline is the polarizing effects of the religious right. Back in the 1980s, you remember Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, which made itself known during the Reagan administration. And they came through at that time to become a significant voting bloc. But I think this also had some polarizing effects in communities around America. And some people began to look down upon people who are going to church because of this political clout that they seemed to have at the time. So that may be another reason for the decline that went back to the 1980s. In the 1990s, if you had kids back then, you know that in many cases, schools would not hold events, certainly not on Sunday. And they would not even hold it on Wednesday nights, knowing that there are church events going on Wednesday night and athletics, groups of any kind of church, or rather a school group, would not meet on Wednesday night, knowing that some kids had church on Wednesday night and they wouldn't interrupt that. But since the 1990s, that has been going away. I'm not trying to blame the schools here, but they're merely going along with whatever the availability of kids are who are going to school at the time, and they recognize that a lot of people aren't going to church anymore, and so they're starting to have soccer practice, soccer games, scouting stuff going on all these different times. You even see tournaments being held on Sunday mornings anymore, school tournaments for whatever kind of sport or activity that directly conflicts with church attendance. And yes, it is and has been drawing away folks from going to church. It might be a case of chicken or the egg, which came first, people going away from church or people or schools holding events at that time. I think it's probably not the school's fault. It's probably the fact that people are not going. But it's another reason for the decline. A fourth reason for the decline over the last 40 years might be called the 9/11 effect, going back to September the 11th of 2001, when what was the kind of people who were slamming these planes into these buildings, killing thousands of people? Well, they're religious fanatics. And I think overall, people around the world began to be very suspicious of religious fanatics, not just Muslims, but Christian fanatics as well. And this may have also contributed to the decline in church attendance over time. A fifth reason for the decline could be the effects of social media on socialization, as more and more people are getting focused on their phone, and they're looking down all the time at what's on their phone, and they're not socializing with one another. People are becoming less adept at having friends, at building groups and building community with other people, and going to church. It no longer seems fruitful to people when they can watch a sermon if they want on their smartphone or in their computer at home. But the effects of social media on socialization has also affected, I think, church attendance to some degree. A sixth reason that someone has put out there as a reason for church decline is that children are rejecting the evangelicalism of their parents. This is something that started to rear its head in the 2010s. This particular factor, I believe, was traced by the book on de-churching that I cited at the beginning of this particular presentation. A seventh reason for the decline is that secular culture is now in and religious culture is now out. I know I had for decades pointed to Europe as a culture that was no longer religious. People were no longer attending church over there back 30 years ago, and it had become a secular culture. But here in America, 30, 40 years ago, we could still call America a religious culture. Not true anymore, is it? The secular culture is in and the religious culture is out. And it's very difficult for churches to survive in this kind of a culture. Reason number 8, significant decline in birth rates. This is another researcher has posted this as a possible reason for people not going to church anymore. And here's a chart. Back here in 1980, you can see that about 67 births per 1,000 women at that time was typical in 1980. But notice where this has dropped dramatically since the year 2007. We're way down here now in 2020, down to about 55 from up there on 70. So it has dropped significantly over that period of time. And the idea here is, it used to be back in the 50s with the baby boom, when parents were having lots of kids and most people are going to church, the next generation of church could be somewhat guaranteed of having a lot of people still going because those kids would grow up and they would be going to church. And so there's sort of this guarantee. Well, with fewer birth rates, fewer kids, and also now fewer parents going to church, it's spelling a disaster for the future of church attendance in America. Reason number 9 is the negative effects of evangelical political power. This kind of goes along with that point I made earlier about the religious right in the 1980s and the moral majority. But evangelicals got to be known as a political group that people were coveting to get their attention. But it turns out with Donald Trump in the 2024 election, he pretty much ignored the evangelicals where he was catering to them back in previous elections. But now people are fed up with evangelicals trying to be political powerhouses, and I think this is having negative effects also on church attendance. People just don't want to have anything to do with what's going on there. And so then one more, a 10th reason for a decline, and you may have been thinking this all along, the pandemic. Yes, this did have an effect when every church around the world was forced to shut down in March and April and May of 2020, and many of them stayed shut down for many months after that. There was a whole lot of people who had been in the habit of going to church who were suddenly forced to experience the habit of not going. And then once their church resumed having services, these people said, you know, I'm kind of liking my Sundays the way they are. And they're not going anymore. Are they? Almost every church, every pastor in America and perhaps in the world has realized the negative effects of the pandemic on church attendance. Now, yes, there are some churches that have regained the strength that they had in 2019, but those churches are a rarity. On average, from various statistics that I've seen, churches have lost about 20% of their attendees over the last 3 years due to the effects of the pandemic. Now, some of them are slowly gaining some of them back, but a lot of them are losing even more than what they lost because the critical mass is starting to be diminished greatly. So some random observations. Let's wrap this thing up. Now, your random observations may be just as valid as my own, but I'll share with you some thoughts that at least occur to me on this issue. First, I would say to pastors, it's not your fault. I've been in that role. I've been a pastor of a small church. And when church attendance starts to decline, the immediate reaction by pastors is to blame themselves. And yes, it is sometimes true that pastors can have a role in the decline of church attendance, and it's also true that they can have a huge role in a spike in attendance. Yet what's going on in America right now is not the fault of the pastor. There's this general malaise that applies to church attendance that is affecting everything. We have this secular culture now. It's not a religious culture, and it's gradually diminishing what we have. And so pastors, it's not your fault. And folks, if you're wanting to blame your pastor, please don't. I mean, they're bearing a huge weight of guilt already, and you don't need to be adding to that. Believe me, they're trying to struggle to survive themselves in the midst of this. Another observation I would have is that, a small church can be healthy and happy. In the first century church, all churches were small churches. They didn't have church buildings back then. Rather, they met in people's homes. And so by their very nature, they could not have gatherings of more than 40 people. It would be really rare to get it to be more than that. So it was very common. But something else was going on in the first century that made those churches healthy and happy. But we can realize that a small church in our day and age can also be healthy and happy. Just think about that. It's also occurred to me, and has been aware to me for the last 50 years, that very few churches have excelled at evangelism. actual real evangelism, of gaining converts to Jesus, and adding new people to the church through evangelism. But it's been a rarity. And I think for the most part, churches, frankly, are at a loss of knowing what to do to try to reach the modern culture. This requires a good bit of study and analysis and some hard work. But I think we can make some progress in this area, but it's a whole other topic. Another thing I think we've failed at is relational maturity. Because if churches are losing their attendees, and they are, but if they had been building close relationships with the people within your church, if they were tightly knit together to one another, to their brothers and sisters in Christ, as the Bible called them back in the first century, they would be much less likely to quit going and no longer associate with all those close friends and brothers and sisters in Christ with whom they had built such close working relationships over the years. But we failed, I think, at relational maturity, so that people can easily just get up from their pew, walk out the door, and never come back and never think a thing of it. And a lot of people wouldn't even know that they were gone, because we don't have relationships in our churches anymore, or in very few we do. So we've got to do a better job in this category. And I think we need to rethink the very concept of church. You know, the Greek word for church, you may have heard this before, is ekklesia. And the word ekklesia never refers to a building. It always refers to a gathering, to an assembly of some kind. I think we need to rethink assembly and what's really important when we get together. I have a whole series of videos that are on this topic. I won't go into this here, but if you want to look at my other videos on worship on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/@TomWadsworth, you can see those. But some more random observations may be useful here. Some thoughts for the future church. It occurs to me, if I were to predict what's going to happen here in the next 10, 20 years, most small churches are going to get smaller. How can they get bigger when they're mostly older folks, and those older folks, frankly, are going to die off? I'm going to die off. I'm no longer to be there anymore. The churches that all these old folks are attending are going to get smaller. How can they get bigger if you don't have young people for them to have some camaraderie with? But there are here's some good news, I guess. There will be a few big churches that will get bigger, because you're going to have people who don't want to go to a church that has 40 people or less. They're going to want to go to something that's got more programs, activities for youth. There's something going on that seems to be meeting their needs. And so they're going to start to gravitate to these very few churches that are bigger. And as I pointed out earlier, only 4 churches in Dixon have 100 or more. And it's probably now down to 3 churches that have 100 or more. So people are going to start to go to those bigger churches, and they're going to gain from the loss of the smaller churches for at least a temporary period of time. I think one other thought about the future is that I think we need to increase interchurch cooperation. Why are you suffering alone? If you have any sensibility in you that you can have some fellowship with another church, maybe just a couple of blocks away, why don't you do that? Maybe between the two of you, you could develop a youth group that thrives. You could afford somebody that's working for in the youth category, or some other ministry that you want to focus on. But by yourself, you're not able to do it. But with other cooperation, you can. Now, in my experience in this field, I think it's really doubtful that pastors and churches will be willing to have this kind of interchurch cooperation. They're still going to be resorting to their old partisan attitudes of fighting against one another and being critical of one another and firing away at somebody else's doctrine that happens to be different than yours. And as long as you do that, you are guaranteeing your own demise. Was it Benjamin Franklin that once said, if we don't hang together, we shall all surely hang separately. And I think the time has come when we need to band together and to see what we could do as a cooperative group of churches instead of just trying to go alone. It's going to get tougher for the small churches that are going it alone. And if it's true that more and more churches are getting older, and it is true, why aren't we finding more ways to serve our seniors? They have unique needs. They have unique struggles that we could be, as churches, meeting needs of. Yes, they're going to die off. Yes, when they go, our church is going to go. But in the meantime, if you really believe in helping one another, loving one another, caring for one another, and if you really believe that the widows and the orphans need to be taken care of, as the New Testament says, we got a lot of these seniors. What are you doing to help them? Maybe you have a whole new mission here that could keep your church alive even until finally it dies, but at least you're going to be fulfilling a particular mission that's useful and it's making a difference in your community. And finally, I would say we need to rethink buildings. These buildings cost a lot of money to buy them, to build them, to maintain them. The heating bill, the cooling bill, the maintenance, replacing the roof. You see where this is going, and you already know, if you're close to the financial picture of your church, that this is an expensive proposition. Maybe it's time we look at alternative ways of church, of getting together, just as a matter of survival. If you want to have enough money to pay a pastor, if that's indeed your desire, maybe you need to forego the building in order to get that done. Or maybe you need to join together with another church in town, so you both meet in a neutral place, and that's where you meet together. Anyway, these are just some ideas. Throw them out. You can dismiss them all. Call some of them heretical. I don't care. But the bottom line is here. We have a crisis in front of us. I call it the coming church attendance crisis, but really, it's not a coming crisis at all. The crisis is already here. It came 20 years ago, and church attendance is continuing to plummet at an alarming rate. And with the large number of seniors now in our churches, it's only going to decrease even faster. And we're going to see more churches closing in the next 10 years. And just to throw out a prediction, this year is the end of 2024 when I'm recording this. In 10 years, by 2034, I'm guessing there will be 10 fewer churches in Dixon and maybe more. The 30 churches that are still alive will be down to 20. And those that are still alive there will just be hanging on by the nape of their neck, by the skin of their teeth, in order to make it a few more years. Yet there will be a few churches that do well, but you need to figure out how you can be one of those few. Those are my thoughts. That's my research. I really hope this is of help to somebody somewhere. I'm not being a doom and gloom here person. I'm really trying to share this information in a way that compels you to do something about it. I'm willing to help in my community, but the fact is, this is not just Dixon we're talking about here. I have reason to believe that this church attendance crisis exists in every city in America, in North America, and possibly throughout the world. But I can at least speak for North America. This problem is there. Is your church going to survive for another 10 years? I leave you with that question. Thanks for listening.